Welcome to the Michigan Experience, where we highlight Michigan's contemporary and historical contributions. I'm your host, Michael J. Thorpe. It's the responsibility of every American community to remember, honor, and capture the stories of its veterans. With this project, we recognize our brave Michigan veterans for their service, hoping to inspire communities to forge a closer connection with veterans and their experiences. On this episode, Vietnam Veterans, we share the stories of Michigan veterans who served during the Vietnam War, a conflict that was not only highly unpopular, but also divided the nation. While that war was over 50 years ago and opinions of the conflict have changed, it's important to those brave men and women that we do not forget their sacrifice and their service to our country.
What I would say to our sisters and brothers who served in Vietnam is that for 241 years as a republic, men and women of our nation have left home, have gone to protect us, and they've risked everything. And for almost all of those 241 years, our nation has done a commendable job of recognizing their sacrifice and their service, with one exception. And that exception is the Vietnam War. And what I want to say to our veterans of the Vietnam War is, your nation, your state, your community, we remember, we acknowledge, and we thank you for your sacrifice. And whether you served in country, in Vietnam, where if you were a soldier in country, in Vietnam, in 365 days, on average, you were in contact with the enemies of the United States for 240 days. If you were a soldier in Vietnam, 1 out of 10 was either injured or killed. So every one of those veterans from that era who served in country, but also the veterans who never left CONUS, or the veterans who were standing their watch in West Germany to defeat the Soviet Union and communism, thank you.
A carrier at sea is extremely vulnerable. Since her striking arm requires the use of exotic fuels and powerful weapons, she's forced to carry with her the potential for her own destruction.
David Fix was stationed aboard a gigantic aircraft carrier where planes loaded with bombs took off on combat missions and landed safely back on the deck when they were finished. On the morning of July 29, 1967, as the planes were getting ready for an airstrike in North Vietnam, in one split second, everything took a turn for the worst, as the lives of over 5,000 officers and enlisted men aboard the USS Forrestal were in danger.
I finally got my orders, and I was to report to a ship called the USS Forrestal. It was an aircraft carrier, and that carrier was going to Nam. I went down to Norfolk, Virginia, which is where the ship was. It was tied up to the dock there. And I got on, and I was 19 years old, never been away from home. It was just surreal. The Forrestal was so big that it could not go through the Soo locks down in Panama and then take the Pacific Ocean over. We had to go all the way across the Atlantic, around South Africa, up to Madagascar, then Korea, and then up into what we call Yankee Station in Vietnam, in the Gulf of Tonkin. On the morning of July 29th, it was, we were launching airstrikes just like any other day. And I was in the aft part of the ship, and I was about 3 decks down underneath the flight deck. 10:53 in the morning, I'm walking in one of these berthing compartments, and all of a sudden, my head was on the ceiling. I had something happened to the ship. It was a loud explosion, and it just sank the ship way down, and I ended up right up on the ceiling and smashed my head up on the ceiling. And I said, what in the heck is that? So 10 seconds after that, I hear the general quarters alarm. That's where everybody on board ship has a place to go and a job to do, and they had to get there. Now, I'm 400 or 500 feet from where I'm supposed to be for the general quarters alarm. So I go down the starboard side of the ship, go through all of these places, and my general quarters station was in a stairwell right outside the sick bay. There was fire extinguishers and fire hoses and stuff in this stairwell, and a stairwell going up to the flight deck. So none of us knows what's going on. We thought we got attacked, really. I mean, we heard these explosions, one right after another, about 7 or 9 explosions, and every one of them just shook the ship and sank the ship down into the water, and then it bounced back up, and we didn't have any idea what was going on at the time. Well, up on the flight deck, what was going on was a rocket. We were launching airstrikes, and one of the planes up there had a Zuni rocket on it. This Zuni rocket dropped off the wing of the plane and ignited and took off across the flight deck, and it ran into John McCain's plane. John McCain was a shipmate of mine, and he was a fighter pilot. He was a lieutenant commander. This Zuni rocket ran into his plane, and his plane ignited. It hit one of the external gas tanks underneath the airplane, and his cockpit opened up, and John McCain got out of the cockpit and was sliding down the nose of the aircraft, and he took his hands and he jumped off onto the flight deck and ran about maybe 20 or 25 feet away from his burning plane, and it exploded. It had 750-pound bombs on this plane, and those bombs exploded, and the shrapnel was killing people. It was igniting other aircraft on the flight deck, and pretty soon, within 2 or 3 minutes, the whole aft part of the flight deck was on fire. We were down in our repair party, and eventually, and because we were outside of sick bay, they were using our stairway to bring the wounded down into sick bay through our stairway, and we were seeing all of these wounded guys, and it was just can't even talk about it, really. I mean, there were people that were just, I know some of them didn't make it. So we grabbed our hose from the stairway, charged the fire, and went up to the flight deck to see if we could help put this fire out. We had a destroyer that got up alongside of us, and they energized their fire hoses, and they were spraying up to the flight deck to try to put part of the fire out. And then we had a couple of helicopters that were taking the dead and injured, and they were flying them over to 2 other ships. All told, we lost 134 men that day, and it was considered at the time to be one of the worst naval disasters in naval history.
just a loud explosion all at once. And I looked back and saw the doors falling off like they really never was attached.
Operation Babylift was enacted during the closing days of the war to get orphans out of Vietnam before the fall of Saigon. Phil Wise was a medical technician in the United States Air Force. He was on board a C-5A Galaxy aircraft loaded with hundreds of babies, children, and adults. The crowded plane took off, and the evacuation ordered by President Ford seemed to be headed towards success until the rear doors blew off at 25,000 feet, and everything changed.
We started in-planing the kids, and we started with the infants by placing them upstairs on the C5 in the crew compartment. So we formed this chain line where we would pass the kids up the ladder and place them in their seats. And all the older kids and adults and litter patients were positioned in the cargo section on the floor. We didn't have seats down there. We sat on the floor, and we used military cargo tie-down straps across our laps to secure us in for takeoff. I remember the door closing and the engines starting up, and all of a sudden this fresh, cold air started coming through the cabin, which we really needed because it was so hot. Of course, the stench of these kids needing diaper changes and things like that was pretty raw. 15 minutes into the flight, normally when we fly over a combat zone, we usually cruise at an altitude between 35,000 and 50,000 feet. So we had taken off, we got up to about 25,000 feet, or close to it, and suddenly this loud explosion happened, or this loud noise, boom, happened. And I looked back, and I saw the rear cargo doors and ramp rip off the aircraft, and we were at 23,000 plus feet. And I remember seeing the sky, blue sky, the white clouds, and the cold air. And everything that we had placed in the rear of the aircraft, or aft of the aircraft, went out with the doors. And I remember hearing the screaming and yelling, and a lot of fog in the air. I remember being thrown about. I'm not sure if I grabbed the cargo tie-down strap or not, but I got to the point where I tried to breathe and I couldn't breathe. And at that point, we were in what they call a rapid decompression. So all the oxygen in the cabin had left out the cabin when the doors went out. So at 20-something thousand feet, we didn't have anything to breathe. I remember seeing bodies sucked out. I remember the coldness. And at that point, I knew it was abnormal to see the sky. At that point, I tried to stay focused because I never thought I was going to die. I didn't have time to think about that, but the screaming and the yelling and the fear around me was saying otherwise. So therefore, I didn't have time to be afraid because I was unable to breathe. I tried to breathe, but I couldn't breathe. Well, the pilot, what he did, he tried to turn the aircraft around and go back to the base at Tansanut Air Force Base, Saigon. And when the doors blew off, that broke the hydraulic system that was a part of the aircraft. So the pilot had trouble maneuvering the aircraft. So what he did, he would descend down and try to pull the aircraft up to break its descent, the speed of descent. He would go down and pull it up. So we got to the point where we were over the South China Sea when the doors blew off, by the way. So instead of crash landing in the South China Sea, he tried to make it back to the base. And he realized that he wasn't going to make it. He was able to get to the rice paddies, and he clipped this tree line, and he ended up bellowing down after clipping the tree line. And we had the Saigon River. He ended up bellowing down on one side of the Saigon River, and we went airborne again. And we just barely cleared the other side of the river. The aircraft bounced and bounced and broke apart. And keep in mind that when we bellied down, we had a belly full of passengers. And of course, I was down there myself. And the crew compartment, which was upstairs. Now the C-5, from the wheel to tail, is a 5-story aircraft. So when we bellied down, the whole bottom just demolished, was flat, and debris was scattered from out. The crew compartment where the babies were, that part slid off the belly of the cargo section like a toboggan. You know, it slides off, it broke away, and it rolled over and kind of slid off. So we only lost 2 kids in the crew compartment. But in the cargo compartment, we lost everybody. I found out later that I was the only survivor out of nearly 200 out of that cargo section. Air America, which is an arm of the CIA, they cordoned off the crash site, because as soon as the plane crashed, the local villagers just raced to the crash site, just pillaging the crash site, just taking whatever they could. The CIA saw me off to a distance in the burning wreckage, and my uniform was a white shirt with dress blue trousers. So they saw my white shirt off to a distance. They said, wow, we gotta save the medic's body so it won't burn. So once they got to me, they found me hanging upside down, my left leg entangled in wire cable, and my head was open, my eyeball hanging out, my chest. They said, well, we better save his body so it won't charge. So they got to untangling me, and then they said, wow, this dude's still alive.
That's it for this edition of the Michigan Experience, Vietnam Veterans. Remember to honor the veterans in your community, and don't forget to thank them for their service. We'll see you next time. I'm Michael J. Thorpe.
I just think it's so important that stories of veterans are collected. I had the honor of serving in the United States Navy Reserve, was a CB combat warfare specialist, a lieutenant commander, and while I was there I met some of the most honorable people that you would ever meet, patriots who believe deeply in the country. They all have wonderful stories to tell. It's important to capture that so that the American people understand that history is not just written with the admirals and the generals and the presidents and big decisions, but history is really written by individual soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors, Coast Guard men that are out there serving their country day and day. That's really the heart and fabric of history. That's where all the context and where all of the content of what the human struggle is all about, it lies with the individual stories.